The Overwatch League regular season has come and gone. You know what that means, don't you? It's awards season, baby! The time of year where we inevitably rage over takes that we see online within this community like a bunch of 10-year-olds. The league in particular usually has a tendency to piss us off some way, somehow, so might as well go out there and leave some opinions of our own before that day comes. And that's what today's video is all about. I'm gonna go through my award selections for this season, and while I'm at it, I'll throw in who I picked originally during the preseason, and who I believe the league will be picking. You'll get all the big name awards the league hands out every single year, as well as some made up ones that we like to do on this channel. Sound good? Great. Let's piss some people off. And what better place to start than the most valuable player, the 2023 Overwatch League MVP award. It's been a hotly contested race for a long time, and there's been a bunch of back and forth in this community, but ultimately I think most parties agree that it comes down to two players, Lip and someone. After a lot of consideration, I believe that the most worthy candidate of winning the most valuable player is Lip. And just for some additional context, this is actually who I picked during the preseason, although a lot of people were probably right there with me, and I also think this is who the league will pick. He's just a popular player who's done a lot this year, so it feels like his selection is all but guaranteed. Lip was a huge factor in why the Atlanta Reign were so dominant this season, and how they were able to completely control the league for more than half of the regular season. Most of those games weren't particularly close either. It was very rare to see somebody push the Atlanta Reign when Sombra was at her full relevance. As things started to change a little bit, obviously the Reign got a little bit worse, but generally they were still the same solid team that we're used to. And it's because of Lip and what he did on the Sombra to get them there to begin with, to put them in this position where there was no reason to be worried. He hard-gapped everybody on this hero. He lapped people in EMP charge like nobody's business, and while some people will say that he did have a tendency to whiff some of these EMPs, it's because of the fact that he could get them so fast and he could up the tempo the way he did that people had a hard time matching the Reign's incredibly quick pace. For the most part, the Reign strategy was Lip go kill, and that is literally in the words of their head coach. It didn't matter what they were playing, what composition they were running, Sombra was going to be a part of it, and Lip was going to roll you over no matter what everybody else on the team was doing. And it got to the point where some teams didn't even want to bother matching them because they knew it was pointless and that the Sombra gap was much too great. We haven't seen dominance like this in a meta all that often throughout this entire league's history. It wasn't until the meta literally started to go away from dive that the Reign lost some of that relevance, and even then they were still a really good team. People are acting like Lip is some kind of Sombra one-trick, and that's just not the case. He is an all-around hit-scan god. It just so happens that most of this year was Sombra-centric, and why should we be blaming him for something like that? So I do think Lip is the MVP, but this is going to sound really stupid. On the ballot itself, I actually voted for someone because why not? This is probably the last ever season that we're getting. Screw the reasoning. Screw the logic. We need a tank MVP. The closest we got is name redacted on Zarya, and he was technically a DPS player. It's obvious that Lip is going to be favored, and if there was a gun pointed to my head, that's who I'd be picking. But I think going with someone would just be a better narrative. As cringy and as cheesy as that sounds, it's the last season. Who really gives a damn at this point? Okay, enough about that. Let's move into Rookie of the Year, where I think the clear-cut pick has to be Sugar Free. For a while, it seemed like Donghack could also be a good pick, but I do think that his relevance started to fall off as Winston became a bit less prevalent in the meta. He struggled a bit more on Ramatra, amongst other things, but Sugar Free was consistently good this year. Maybe his team wasn't finding success to the same degree as Atlanta Reign, but Sugar Free boosted their ceiling for sure. He was a very flexible player for them, and he never saw any fall off regardless of what the team was asking him to play. He was the star playmaker, and the guy this team relied on the most usually, all while making sure everybody else could be within their realm of comfort. Sugar Free basically did double time, and was still a star in the league, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. this rookie class wasn't the most stacked. There were a couple of noteworthy names like Viper and Bliss and Donghack, but Sugar Free generally had the most impact while finding a decent amount of success compared to the APAC guys. So I like Sugar Free as the Rookie of the Year. As for who I picked in the preseason, well, I went with Heesang. And now, if he had been on Vancouver the whole year, maybe this would have been a better pick and it'd be more realistic, but his first half on the Shock left a lot to be desired. There was all drama over there, he wasn't super comfortable, so there's no way this could ever be a realistic pick. And as for who I think the league will be picking, I also think they'll be going with Sugar Free. I think it makes the most sense because they usually don't care about the East for one, but two, we've been waiting to see Sugar Free play for a long time. The narrative is way too fitting, so it's gotta be him or maybe Donghack. Okay, on to Roll Stars, where there's going to be a lot of controversy this year. If you missed it, the Overwatch League changed up the rulings on how the voting works. This season, there is a mandatory 2 players from the East that need to be voted for each position to get us to our grand total of 4. So in other words, there's going to be a lot of Western players that get completely cucked. This rule is complete and utter BS, and I hate it, but there's nothing we can do. So let's get into the voting. For my tanks, I went with someone, Fearless, Mag, and Gushue. My preseason Preds were Fearless, someone, not too bad so far, but then Void and Hanbin. The Void one is yikes, but I do think Hanbin maybe still has a chance. I wouldn't be surprised. But overall, not too bad, I'd say. And for the league, I think they're definitely going with Fearless and someone from the West. And in the East, I can't help but feel like they're going to pick Hanbin and Gushue. I feel like Mag is going to get cucked despite having a really good season because of the love for Gushue and Hanbin, but maybe I'll stand corrected. Okay, so let me justify these picks. Someone and Fearless, I'd say, are very self-explanatory, probably the 2 most dominant tank players in the Overwatch League this season, and this goes double for someone who, in my opinion, was without a doubt the best tank player. He's one of the MVP frontrunners. He just had to be here. He's by far the most flexible tank in this league. There's not many heroes that you can say he is weak on. You didn't get to see it as much this year because of how Winston-centric the meta was, but on that hero, he was still one of the best, so you can't really tack off any points there. And whenever the Mayhem did decide to change things up, he was a focal point. He kind of allowed them to play those different comps and throw out those different looks to get an advantage over other teams because he didn't see any fall off with his other heroes like Rhyme, Zarya, Sigma, etc. He could play anything you need him to and still be the most dominant player out there. For Fearless, I think he was just the best monkey this year. I think most people would agree. Just from like an individual perspective, he is still the Winston god. His carry performances this year were still excellent. Maybe not what we've seen in the past, but he was still there every single game, making a huge difference for the Houston Outlaws. And when push came to shove, he showed that he still is a very smart player who can adapt onto other heroes, like on the Ramatra. There wasn't anything that Fearless looked particularly bad on, and because of it, the Houston Outlaws were always able to dominate up front and enable a good tempo for their team to roll over most, if not all, teams. Mag is like the Eastern version of someone, obviously to a lesser degree, but with similar types of impact, where Soul Infernal all this season were clearly just the most versatile team. It felt like all of the other Eastern teams were stuck in their ways in some places, but Soul Infernal, you never had that concern, and it's all because of how Mag opened up the game. Solid monkey player, especially at the start. He could play Ramatra. His Rhine was amongst one of the best this season. His Wrecking Ball proved to be lethal, and an interesting strategy that kind of gave Soul Infernal an advantage that people weren't prepared for. He just dominated this region. Soul Infernal won so many games, and it's because they could adjust to whatever their opponents were playing and counterpick them appropriately thanks to the redemption arc of Mag and his ability to play well with a support line that's actually good. Thanks a lot, Washington. As for the Gushue pick, it may seem a little controversial. Gushue obviously was mostly just a monkey player this year, but again, Winston was a very important part of the meta, especially in the East, for a very long time, and Gushue still happens to be one of the best monkey players alive. Sure, sometimes the Spark didn't play up to par because they weren't great on rush comps, amongst other things because of Gushue's comfort. I acknowledge this, but whenever the Spark needed him to step up, he usually did. We saw it recently during the summer stage when he'd flex onto Orisa, or with the Doomfist for that Dallas strategy. He always found a way to get it done for his team. He was extremely clutch, and I think one of the better tank players in OWL this year. Now for supports, and this is where I'm gonna be cringe and break the rules. You see, I think it's ridiculous that we're only giving out 2 support role stars to the Western players when they're just infinitely better than what the East is offering. The fact that one of either alexyOWL, Fielder, or Shu is not going to win a role star is a crime, and I am not okay with this. Plus, Overwatch League loves to change up their rules and do unexplainable things all the time. I mean, they called a 5-way tie for DPS in 2020 with their role stars, so who's to say that I can't do the same? We're going with a 3-way tie on support in the West, and we're giving out 5 role stars. We gotta give them to Shu, Fielder, alexyOWL, from the West, and then with the East, I think the only logical picks are Skewed and Bliss. Let's cut straight to the chase here. Fielder, alexyOWL, and Shu were 3 of the best players in the league, let alone their own positions. They took over games in ways that we've seen very few of in the past. Fielder and alexyOWL were just the most unstoppable backline this year. I've said it a million times, and I'm going to stick with that. They're like the most scary thunder and lightning duo out there. They just made it impossible to crack the Atlanta Rain. They were so good at staying alive. Fielder's positioning was absurd, while still finding maximum value with his cooldowns, and doing so much with his playmaking potential. And he's such a great team first kind of guy. He always managed to keep Donghack and his guys alive. Fielder was insanely clutch, and in my opinion, probably the number 3 in terms of the MVP race. And I mean, alexyOWL is alexyOWL, right? Not only did he do all the things you're looking for with the main support, being a team-first guy, having the heals, being smart with your positioning, but he also took it a step further and was a really good playmaker. I'd argue the best playmaker we've ever seen on a natural main support role, that being things like Lucio and Brigitte. Nobody's done it like alexyOWL before. Very rarely do you feel a presence like this. This is a once-in-a-lifetime type of performance, and I just don't think it would be right to not include him in the role star selection. That's what it seems like OWL's going to do, but I will not stand by it. This was an historic year, and he deserves a lot of credit. And with Shu, it's kind of just more of the same. He's been doing this for years. It's nothing new. And to this day, he is without a doubt still the best playmaking flex support in the league. And it's not even close. It's like by a country mile. As much as I love Fielder, Shu just puts it on a completely different level in terms of solo carry potential. His Baptiste mechanics are second to none. His Ana, his aggressive positioning and cooldowns on this hero, nobody can match him. He's just an insanely good player, and he changes the way the game is played for the Outlaws. He just makes them so much more aggressive than you'd see with another support player on the team. He gives them a third DPS, essentially. It's another presence you have to constantly worry about, and there's a lot of other crazy stuff going on in this Outlaws team. Shu just takes it to another level, and you could genuinely argue he was the MVP of their team. To give the East some love, even though they probably don't deserve it, their support players aren't up to par, but rules are rules, I think that Skewed and Bliss are the only natural selections to be making. I think if you had to pick out anyone from that crowd, these 2 did the most on their specific roles. They both were insanely strong. Skewed, I think, by far was the best flex support over in the East. The only one that's comparable to Western players, if I'm being honest with you. He was very, very flexible. Good on pretty much everything he touched. His Ana was amongst one of the best in the Overwatch League, no doubt about it, as well as his Baptiste, going to show that, yeah, playing under Shu for a long time can really do that. You learn a lot. And as for Bliss, as a rookie, he really impressed me. I thought he was one of the best players on the Dallas Fuel. Some might even argue he was their number 1. Genuinely, it gave me vibes of alexyOWL from last year on Dallas. Not to the same extent, obviously, but pretty up there. He helped make up for that big-time loss by doing some similar things that alexyOWL would do, where he'd miraculously stay alive, find some big kills, have some of the best timing out there in the league with his beats and whatnot. He did a lot of good for a rookie, and he really did live up to his potential. I mean, you have to give him a lot of credit. It felt like coming into this year, Dallas would be lacking in the playmaking element with their backline, but I think Bliss has largely helped make up for it. It hasn't been perfect, and you could still tell they're missing people like Fielder and alexyOWL, but he really pulled his weight, if not even more, sometimes making up for the mediocre performances of MCD. Bliss genuinely carried the Dallas Fuel, and I believe he deserves some credit. Oh, as for preseason Preds, they're kind of null and void at this point because of the rule change, but if you were curious, I went with Fielder, Chio, Shu, and Finn. The last one's a yikes, but the other ones I'd say are pretty spot on. As for who I think the league will be selecting, I think they'll likely go with the same players that I brought up, but minus Chio. They've been cucking him all season, they didn't let him be an MVP candidate, and I just know they're going to pick Fielder and Shu over him. It's as clear as day. And finally, the DPS role stars. I'm going with Lip, Happy, Zest, and Leave. Lip is very self-explanatory. He's the MVP of the league, arguably, and if you don't think he's the MVP, he's probably still a role star in your eyes just because of the ridiculous impact he had on the league this season. Enough said. The second Western DPS is where things can get really challenging, though. The second Western DPS is where things get challenging and maybe a little controversial. Honestly, there's a lot of good picks you can make to have next to Lip. You could even pick Stalker if you wanted to. You could go with Decay from Boston. Merit and Checkmate are there as well, but I'm going with Happy. And my reasoning for Happy is because I honestly thought he might have been the second or third best player on Houston, and he did a lot of work in that DPS department, even outshining Pelican, which is not something I thought I'd be saying heading into this year. Usually Happy is a weakness on whatever team he goes to, but this season he ended up being a big-time strength of the Houston Outlaws and what they were doing, and it's largely because he was actually an extremely versatile and helpful player who wasn't just stuck in his ways on being a hot and cold sniper. He was still really good on that stuff when given the opportunity. He'd absolutely take over the league, but where he really shined is on the Tracer and Sombra role. He proved to be elite on both of them, much like how I was talking about with Sugarfree earlier. I'd argue probably the second best Sombra player in the league before they decided to move Pelican over to that role, and then when transitioning to Tracer, he went head-to-head with some pretty strong players on that role, such as Stalker and Decay, sometimes even outplaying these elite players with much more experience on the hero. Generally, I considered Happy to be one of the superstar players of the Overwatch League. This was his best season without a doubt, and I think that the versatility factor, along with the dominance, makes him an ideal DPS role star. Again, I don't think anything's set in stone. You can make an argument for a bunch of people from the West, but Happy in my eyes makes the most sense in terms of value, plus the playmaking and the consistency. With the East role stars, I really don't know. I think that Zest is appropriate because he was in the MVP ballot. He probably shouldn't have been there, but generally he was a really strong presence in the Eastern region, stringing together a lot of dominant performances, especially on the Tracer, one of the elite flex DPS of that region without a doubt. And with Leave, I feel like he did the most for the Spark this season, albeit a little bit quietly, but his Tracer was still extremely good. I think that sometimes he'd make up for the Spark's lack of playmaking on Sombra when Shy would be struggling, and his Echo was good as well. It was a very typical Leave performance, a bit of a bounce back year for sure. But there maybe are some other people you could go with. Some people might even say that Prophet deserves some kind of shout out for carrying the Dynasty, but if we're just going off successful teams, I feel like there has to be an Infernal and a Spark player. I wouldn't really go with any Dallas guys. I feel like Zest and Leave are probably the best choices in terms of showing the littlest weaknesses. Oh, and again, while it's null and void, if you're wondering who my DPS role star predictions were at the beginning of this year, I went with Proper, Lip, Shy, and Pelican. Needless to say, most of these guys are nowhere close to being role star worthy, with the only true guy being Lip, so didn't do too good here. And as to who I think the league will pick, I get the feeling they're going to pick Lip, of course, but then they're going to go with Merit. I feel like the Merit hype has been really big this year, and then I also think their East DPS will be Zest and Leave. I feel like that just makes the most sense. Next up, in terms of official Overwatch League awards, is Coach of the Year. Originally, I went with Krusty, and big yikes there, lol, that was a horrible prediction. But now here in the present day, I think that the most worthy Coach of the Year is Gunba. For a while I thought maybe it should be Gator in the Atlanta Reign, but I feel like Gunba has maybe done a bit more with less than a team like Houston or Atlanta Reign. They didn't have as many stars on paper coming into this year, but they got a lot of value and productivity out of this entire starting lineup. I thought that a bunch of their players from last year made some excellent strides in their game. Checkmate, Someone, RuPaul, all looked good, and the new additions came in and seemed like seamless fits. In the first half of the year, the Mayhem always hung on and were super relevant, still one of the best teams at the dive meta, but then later on in the second half, they literally did not lose a game. They've been undefeated since June, and by far and none the most flexible team in the Overwatch League. Sometimes they maybe tried a bit hard with their creativity, but I think over time they started to figure it out, and it just gave them such a big advantage over some of these other teams who have more exploitable weaknesses. They just came up with a lot of useful strategies that consistently countered the best teams in the league. There's not a single team that they could not defeat, and I think because of their hot streak and somehow having as many wins as Atlanta despite having a little bit less of a talented roster, that Gunba deserves to be the coach of the year, and I think that's probably who the league will end up selecting as well. And finally, the last official Overwatch League award is the Dennis Hawelka Award, which usually goes to someone who's had a profound impact within the community. Now, usually I wouldn't agree with Redditors and with YouTube hate comment sections, but I gotta say, they're on the nose. I've started to realize this year that this award has lost its meaning. Originally, it was about sportsmanship and kindness with Mickey, but then it kind of evolved into doing more for the greater community, like we saw with Custa and McGravy, speaking out on greater social issues and running charities and whatnot. But since 2021, it just hasn't been that way, so it's kind of a joke at this point. But I'm still going to say it's someone because he does have that wholesome boy attitude that would make Mickey proud. Really good guy, great leader. If that's what the award's going to mean now these days, he's probably the perfect candidate. That does it for the official awards, but now time for some ATP community awards. I think some of these are really cool, so feel free to join me down in the comments below and leave some names of your own. And we're going to start with a new one that I did not actually make a prediction for, but decided to incorporate mid-season, and that is the 6th man of the year. What qualifies as a 6th man, you may ask? I'd say it's somebody who is usually on the bench, but sees a decent bit of playtime in a rotation. Somebody who is never really going to be a starter for the most part, maybe occasionally, but they're usually a part of the game plan on specific maps, and they have some kind of impact on a team's ability to find success. And in my eyes, there's only one real appropriate selection, and that's gotta be Shockwave. Most teams unfortunately don't run a bench, but New York, despite not being the best, most certainly did. It was usually Fitz and Psycho that were the starters, and then Shockwave would come in for very specific maps, like on Hybrid or super sniper-centric maps as well. And even the Symmetra too. Sometimes he'd come in to play that role at the beginning of a series, being a spark plug, so to speak. And in other scenarios, after not seeing any action for like the whole series, his number would be called in like a do or die scenario, and he'd show complete and utter composure out there, like in that matchup against the Gladiators, getting subbed in for the final map after not really seeing any playtime, and just destroying them with that New York Rush composition to get a well-needed W. It's stuff like that that makes me believe that Shockwave could be the one and only 6th man of the year. Now for my set of most improved awards. I give one out to a player and a team that showed significant progress compared to what they did in 2022. For most improved player, for a while, after a bunch of self-debate, I settled on Faith. I think there's a lot of guys who are in the running for this kind of award, like Mag, Flora, and others, but a bunch of them lost their appeal over time and maybe lived in the shadows of some other players on their respective teams, but with Faith, you never really felt that. Always in the running constantly from start to finish. While Faith doesn't necessarily fit the mold of going from a god-awful player to a really good one, he did go from mid and unnoticeable to perhaps one of the most underrated main supports in the Overwatch League. Some might even argue he was top 5 level this year. And again, compared to last year where he was just mid and so forgettable, that's a big time upgrade. He was a very consistent piece of the Vancouver Titans, and I think a lot of it has to do with his is Lucio, one of the best playmaking main supports in the league on this hero without a doubt. The environmental kills were flying, his beats were really strong, and I never really felt like he was having some bad performances this year that made you question why Vancouver would be signing him. It was just brilliance every single time the Titans had any kind of fighting chance in a game, and sometimes he'd even be the lead playmaker. I think Faith drew it up perfectly, and by far none had his best season as a pro. He's finally gone from irrelevant and mid and not worth caring about to one of the elite main supports of the game. My preseason prediction, you may ask? RuPaul. Not a terrible guess, I'd like to argue. Speaking of the mayhem, they're actually going to take home my Most Improved Team award. For a very long time, I was on the Atlanta Reign bandwagon. I'd argue you could still make a very strong case for them to win this award. I mean, they literally went from like a 13-win team last year to the 1 seed in the West with less games, mind you, to get to that milestone, and they won Mid-Season Madness. But on the other hand, I feel like Florida more so fit the mold of what it means to be an improved team. I mean, for starters, from a results standpoint, literally the same thing as the Reign. They didn't win Mid-Season Madness or anything, but they got third, which is still very impressive, and they went from like a 500 winning percentage last year to tied for the most wins this season. But on top of it, they have a second layer with that improvement. Unlike the Reign, who kind of just slapped a band-aid to make everything better and replaced their core with a super team, Florida worked at what they already had. They added on to it, but also some of their individual players from last year that are very important to them just got better. Florida all around in every aspect showed improvement as a team and really were impressive this season. I mean, just going from okay last year to potential title contender is a big jump, along with the other stuff I named, so I feel like Florida are a pretty good pick for this. My preseason pred was the Hangzhou Spark, and I feel like that kind of fell through. From a consistency standpoint and how they did in the regular season, maybe a bit of improvement, but generally they didn't have that dominance that you'd expect. So I'd argue they don't even belong in like the top 3 for this kind of award. Now to move on to the final award. The final ATP award is the surprise of the year, where you can name a team, a player, or anything in between for a good or a bad reason. And for me, I think the only appropriate selection is the San Francisco Shock. Maybe you could say Gladiators, but I think Shock are more appropriate for a bad reason because of the enormous expectations on their shoulders just for them to miss the playoffs completely and go 8-8 in the regular season with no real accomplishments, no big tournament victories, and no big wins over the real competition of the league. They were just mediocre, despite being in that conversation to potentially contend for a title this year. That is a major letdown, and it's a huge shocker, no pun intended, because they have Proper and they added on to him with other O2 Blast legends. Never in my right mind did I think that they'd flop before even getting to the playoffs. I thought maybe an early exit in the playoffs could be more realistic. It's a young team. There's room for error and for things to go terribly wrong. But to not even get there, man, wow. They didn't even get out of the first round of the play-ins, let alone the playoffs. That's how disappointing this team was. With all those expectations, with an O2 Blast super team, they have nothing to show for it. And it truly goes to show that the Shock's time in the spotlight is over. I'd say that's probably the wildest thing that happened this year, but maybe you disagree with me. And in terms of what I was going for with a preseason pred, technically it still has a chance to come true, but even if it does, I don't think it'll be the surprise of the year. Originally, I said Dallas were going to be top 4 in the playoffs, but I don't think that's going to trump the Shock. There's just no way in hell that is going to happen. Regardless, that is going to wrap up ATP's 2023 Overwatch League regular season awards. Let me know what you think about my picks down in the comments below, and leave your own as well. I'd love to hear your opinion on what your takes are on how this regular season went. And if you enjoyed the video and you want more Overwatch League content, be sure to give this one a like and subscribe to the channel and enable that bell icon for notifications so you don't miss out on the next video. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.